George trusted his children with his money, his medications, his entire life. So when his 80-year-old neighbor Dorothy reported them for elder abuse, he was furious. He called her a liar. He shut the door in her face. But Dorothy had been watching from her window for months. She'd seen the bank visits, the pill bottles, the slow fog that settled over George after every evening cup of tea. She knew the signs because she'd lost her own husband to the exact same scheme. And this time she refused to stay silent. George Hartwell spent 30 years teaching students to question everything, but when it came to his own children, he stopped asking questions. That mistake nearly cost him his freedom, his mind, and his life. And the only reason he survived was a woman he'd spent years overlooking. George Hartwell's life had followed a predictable arc. 30 years in a classroom, a mortgage paid off in 22, a marriage that lasted until Margaret's cancer diagnosis 5 years ago. When she passed, the house on Maple Street grew quiet in ways George couldn't fix. So when his son David and daughter Nancy offered to help manage things, he said yes. He said yes to the joint bank account. He said yes to the power of attorney. He said yes to the evening tea Nancy insisted on bringing over every night at 7, chamomile with honey, just the way he liked it. He didn't notice when his memory started slipping. He didn't notice when $220,000 vanished from his retirement accounts over the course of 24 months. He was 70 years old, foggy but agreeable, and his children told him everything was fine. Across the street, Dorothy Simmons was watching. She was 80, a widow, and invisible in the way old women become invisible. She'd lived on Maple Street for 41 years. She knew the mailman's schedule, the garbage truck's rhythm, and the exact hour Nancy Hartwell arrived every evening with a thermos in one hand and a fold of papers in the other. Dorothy also knew what it looked like when a person's mind was being slowly dismantled by something in their cup. She'd watched her own husband, Alan, deteriorate the same way a decade earlier. His stepchildren had drained $300,000 from his accounts and kept him sedated on crushed clonazepam dissolved in his nightly scotch. By the time anyone believed her, Alan was dead and the money was gone. So Dorothy made a phone call, anonymous, Adult Protective Services. She told them an elderly neighbor was showing signs of cognitive decline, possible financial exploitation, and unusual medication effects after evening visits. She gave them the address and hung up. 2 days later, a caseworker named Maria Reyes knocked on George Hartwell's door. George was bewildered. Then he was humiliated. Then he was furious. He demanded to know who had reported him. When Maria, following protocol, refused to disclose the source, George did what any man in his position would do. He called his children. David drove over immediately, calm and reassuring. Nancy arrived with a fresh thermos. They sat with their father, explained that these reports were often filed by bitter old neighbors with nothing better to do, and assured him they would handle everything. Later that evening, George walked across the street. He stood on Dorothy Simmons' porch, his face tight with anger, and told her he knew it was her. She didn't deny it. She tried to explain, but George cut her off. "You don't know my family," he said. "You don't know what we've been through." He told her to stay out of his life. Then he went home and drank his tea. The APS investigation, however, did not stop. Maria Reyes had seen enough cases to know when something felt wrong, and something felt very wrong. She scheduled a follow-up. She requested financial records. She asked George's doctor to run a blood panel, just routine, she said, but the blood work would tell a story no one was prepared to hear. The blood panel came back on a Thursday. George's doctor called him personally, which almost never happens. The doctor said his blood contained trace amounts of lorazepam, a sedative George had never been prescribed. The levels were consistent with nightly ingestion, not a single incident. They were low enough to escape notice, just enough to make an old man feel tired, confused, and compliant. George held the phone and said nothing. He thought about the tea. He thought about Nancy's smile as she handed him the thermos every evening. He thought about the fuzzy gaps in his memory, the contracts he'd signed without fully understanding, the strange new account numbers David had explained with patient condescension. And for the first time in 2 years, George felt something break through the fog. Clarity, cold and sharp as a blade, told him he had made a catastrophic mistake. Maria Reyes had already pulled the financials. That part was easier than George expected. Joint account statements showed a pattern of withdrawals that matched no legitimate expense. $40,000 for home renovations that never happened, according to the contractor she called. $55,000 to a shell company registered in David's wife's maiden name, then dissolved 6 months later. Transfers to an offshore account in the Caymans, small amounts at first, then larger, always just below the reporting threshold. All authorized with George's signature, but the handwriting analysis later showed the signatures were inconsistent during the periods when George was most heavily sedated. By the time Maria finished her preliminary report, the total was $220,000. $220,000, and every single transaction had a paper trail that led directly back to David and Nancy Hartwell. George's reaction unfolded in 3 distinct stages. First, denial squared. He called David, who told him the blood work was a mistake, the bank records were being misread, and this was all Dorothy's fault for starting the investigation. Second, doubt. He called Nancy, who cried and said she couldn't believe her own father would accuse her of something so monstrous. She reminded him that she'd been the one bringing him tea every night since Mom died. She said the word tea like it was a sacred ritual, and George felt guilt twist his stomach. But the third stage arrived the next morning, when Maria sent him the bank statements with the transactions highlighted in yellow. He spread them across his kitchen table, and for 6 hours he traced every line, every date, every false signature. And then he called the number Dorothy had left on a note tucked into his mailbox a month ago, the one he'd torn up. He found the pieces in his trash can and taped them together. Her voice on the other end was soft. "I've been waiting," she said. "Not I told you so, just waiting." Dorothy Simmons had kept a journal. She started it the day she noticed George couldn't remember her name, even though they'd chatted on their porches for years. She documented the arrival times of David and Nancy, the days George signed documents on his front porch, the evenings he stumbled while walking to the mailbox. She had written about Alan. She had written about her own powerlessness a decade ago. And in the last entry, 3 days before she made the call, she had written, "George is slipping faster now. I see the same stillness in his eyes that I saw in Alan's. I will not watch another man die while his family drains him dry. I will not." That journal became a centerpiece of the investigation. But here's the thing about elder predators. They don't stop until someone makes them stop. David and Nancy knew the APS case was heating up. They knew the blood work had come back. And instead of retreating, they accelerated. They showed up at George's house with a notarized document transferring full guardianship to David, claiming their father was mentally incompetent. They had his signature, dated 2 weeks earlier, from a period when blood records showed lorazepam levels were at their highest. George looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw for the first time not the boy he'd raised, but a stranger who had been methodically emptying his life. He didn't sign anything. He asked them to leave. Then he picked up the phone and called the police. That single act ended a 2-year silence, and what the police uncovered next would shatter everything. When the police executed a search warrant on David Hartwell's home, they found more than they expected. They expected financial documents. They found those, but they also found a locked filing cabinet in the garage containing a second set of records. These weren't the careful spreadsheets David showed his father. These were the real accounts, meticulously tracking every transfer, every forged signature, every dollar that had been swept from George's retirement funds into a web of shell companies stretching across 3 states. The total wasn't just $220,000. It was closer to $340,000 when you counted the reverse mortgage they'd taken out on George's house without his knowledge. A house that was fully paid off. A house George believed was his, free and clear. He was wrong. Nancy's apartment yielded something even more disturbing. The police recovered a laptop with search history that made the case take a dark turn. She had been researching lorazepam dosages for elderly patients, specifically looking up information about how to avoid detection in routine blood work. The searches dated back 18 months. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a slow, methodical plan executed by 2 people who studied how to dismantle their father's mind without leaving tracks. They timed the doses to be metabolized before morning blood draws. They knew exactly how much would keep him foggy, but not unconscious during phone calls with his financial advisor. They had turned their father into a living bank account, and they'd been withdrawing from it at will. But the investigation took an even sharper twist when detectives interviewed the pharmacist who filled George's prescriptions. The pharmacist, a man named Robert Chen, told police that Nancy had come in 6 months earlier with a handwritten note supposedly from George's doctor, requesting a switch in his blood pressure medication. The note was fake. The doctor confirmed he never wrote it. Nancy had been attempting to get a prescription for propranolol in her father's name, a beta blocker that, combined with lorazepam, would have dramatically amplified the sedative effect. She was trying to make the tea stronger. She was trying to make him more compliant. Robert Chen said something in his interview that stuck with the lead detective. He said Nancy smiled too much. She was too friendly. He'd been a pharmacist for 22 years, and he'd learned that the people most eager to pick up medication for the elderly are often the ones you need to watch the closest. The financial forensic audit took 3 weeks to complete. What emerged was a portrait of systematic exploitation that began almost immediately after Margaret's death. David and Nancy had positioned themselves as indispensable helpers in George's grief, and then they'd used that position to extract everything they could. They opened credit cards in his name, maxed them out, and paid the minimum from his checking account. They refinanced his car, a 2015 Subaru with low mileage, and pocketed the equity. They even withdrew small amounts from his pension, amounts small enough that George wouldn't notice, less than $500 a month, but 18 months of those withdrawals added up to $9,000. The cumulative effect was staggering. George Hartwell, a retired history teacher with a modest but comfortable nest egg, was being hollowed out from the inside by the two people he trusted most in the world. Dorothy Simmons watched the police cars come and go from her window. She didn't feel vindication. She told a neighbor later that she felt the same hollow ache she'd felt when Alan died, the same exhaustion of being right about something terrible. She had kept her husband's case file in a cardboard box in her basement for 10 years, unable to throw it away, unable to look at it. After the police finished their initial investigation into George's children, Dorothy finally pulled that box out again. She opened it and found the records of Alan's stepchildren, Lisa and Mark, who had used crushed clonazepam in his scotch for 2 years. The method was almost identical. The pattern of withdrawal amounts matched. Even the fake guardianship petition they tried to file had the same wording as the one David had drafted. The parallels were so precise that the state attorney general's office opened a secondary investigation into Alan Simmons' death, a decade cold, now suddenly warm with fresh evidence. But for George, the worst part wasn't the money. It wasn't even the drugging. It was the realization that his children had looked at him, across dinner tables and birthday parties and Sunday phone calls, and seen not a father but an obstacle. They had calculated the dosage of tea that would keep him from asking the wrong questions. They had hugged him goodbye and then logged into his bank account from their phones in the driveway. They had told him they loved him and then forged his signature on documents that stripped him of everything. That betrayal landed in George's chest like a physical wound. He told a therapist later that he woke up every morning for 2 months with the sensation of being crushed, not metaphorically. He felt pressure on his ribs, the weight of the understanding that his own children had been slowly erasing him. And yet, the most unexpected consequence of the whole ordeal was already unfolding on Maple Street. 2 houses separated by a quiet street, each holding a person who had been betrayed by the people they raised. George Hartwell and Dorothy Simmons, both widowed, both stripped of illusion, began to talk, first across the porch, then over coffee on her front steps, then at his kitchen table where the documents had once been spread. They talked about Alan. They talked about Margaret. They talked about the precise betrayal of being drugged by the people you trusted. Dorothy described the fog Alan was in during his final months. George recognized every symptom. They were not just witnesses to each other's suffering. They were proof that someone else understood, really understood, what it felt like to be erased by your own blood. That bond, unexpected and unbreakable, was about to give both of them the strength to face what came next. What came next was a courtroom. David and Nancy Hartwell were arrested on 15 counts including elder exploitation, fraud, and administering a harmful substance without consent. Their trial lasted 3 weeks. Dorothy Simmons' journal was entered as evidence, its meticulous entries spanning months of observation, each one a small brick in the wall of the prosecution's case. The pharmacist Robert Chen described Nancy's demeanor with an unnerving calm that made the jury shift in their seats. Maria Reyes laid out the forensic audit, the numbers so stark and damning that David's attorney visibly struggled to find any alternate explanation. And then George took the stand. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He answered each question with the measured clarity of a man who taught critical thinking for 3 decades and was now applying it to his own life. When the prosecutor asked him what he felt, George paused and said, "I feel like a man who finally woke up." That line stayed in the jury's minds. The verdict came back in 4 hours, guilty on all major counts. David was sentenced to 12 years. Nancy received 10. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, noted the calculated cruelty of the sedative, the exploitation of a grieving father, and the betrayal of the most fundamental trust. She also noted that without Dorothy Simmons' initial report, George Hartwell might have been dead within a year, either from the accumulating effects of the medication or from the despair of losing everything he'd built. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, former students, and reporters. When the sentences were read, George sat in the front row, hands folded, and nodded once. Then he turned to Dorothy, who was sitting beside him, and took her hand. The financial recovery was complex but successful. Under an independent trusteeship, George's remaining assets were consolidated, the fraudulent accounts closed, and the reverse mortgage reversed. The house on Maple Street was his again, free and clear. Most of the stolen money was recovered, frozen in shell company accounts before David and Nancy could move it further. What couldn't be returned was the trust. That wound was permanent. George told a reporter for the local paper that he still woke up sometimes reaching for a cup of tea that wasn't there, the phantom taste of chamomile and lorazepam on his tongue. But he said he slept better with the lights on and the windows open, letting the night air in from across the street where Dorothy's porch light always burned. And that was the part of the story that surprised everyone, including George and Dorothy themselves. Two people in their later years, both hollowed out by the worst kind of betrayal, began to rebuild together, not in a dramatic romantic fashion, but in the steady, companionable way of two people who have seen the same darkness and recognized it in each other. George fixed Dorothy's porch step. Dorothy started bringing him coffee in the mornings, black, no tea. They sat together on her front steps in the evenings, and George told her stories about his students. Dorothy talked about Alan, finally able to speak his name without the weight of guilt pressing down on her chest. The neighborhood watched this unlikely friendship bloom with a mixture of wonder and quiet respect. But the story doesn't end there, because Dorothy's journal, once entered into evidence, triggered a broader inquiry. The State Attorney General's Cold Case Unit, already looking into Alan Simmons' death, discovered something that turned a single family tragedy into a pattern. Alan's stepchildren, Lisa and Mark, had used a local attorney to draft the guardianship papers they'd attempted to file years ago. That same attorney, a man named Harold Finch, had also prepared the documents David Hartwell tried to use to seize guardianship of George. The wording was identical in 17 separate clauses. This was not coincidence. It was a playbook. A further investigation revealed that Harold Finch had been quietly facilitating elder exploitation schemes for over a decade, customizing the same legal templates for families looking to drain their parents' assets while dodging oversight. By the time the State Bar Association completed its review, Finch was disbarred and facing criminal charges himself. 5 families came forward, all with stories eerily similar to George and Alan's. Dorothy's lonely act of vigilance from her window had cracked open something much larger than she ever imagined. The final surprise came when Maria Reyes, the original APS caseworker, retired 2 years later and gave an interview. She said something that George kept in a frame on his mantle. "People always ask me how to spot elder abuse. I tell them, look at the person bringing the tea. Look at the person who's always there, always helping, always smiling." The real threat doesn't usually look like a threat. It looks like family. That line from Maria Reyes has stayed with me. Look at the person bringing the tea. It sounds so simple, but elder abuse isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with broken bones and bruises. It arrives with a smile, a signature, and a warm drink at the end of a long day. It wears a familiar face. George Hartwell almost lost everything because he couldn't believe his children would hurt him. Dorothy Simmons almost stayed silent because she'd been ignored before. And somewhere right now, an older person is drinking tea they didn't make themselves, signing documents they don't fully understand, and believing the lie that family always means safety. The Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates that only 1 in 24 cases of elder abuse ever gets reported. The rest happen behind closed doors, in quiet kitchens, on front porches where no one is watching. But Dorothy was watching. And one phone call, anonymous, uncertain, and terrified, saved a man's life. The question I want to leave you with is simple. Who's watching the house across your street? Who's checking in on the neighbor who used to wave but doesn't anymore? You don't need proof. You just need the courage to make the call. It might not be welcome. It might not be easy, but it might be the only thing that keeps someone alive. If this story meant something to you, hit that subscribe button. We tell the stories that are too easy to miss, the ones that happen in the quiet spaces between ordinary lives. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.